We're going to be talking today about the media environment in the New Orleans area, partly as a microcosm for the news media ecosystem of nationally of this country, but also to look specifically at a market that is in many respects unique, as I think we're going to discover. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with some people who know the media system, the media situation in New Orleans very much from the inside. We're joined today by Sherry Alexander, who's Associate Professor, College of Social Sciences at Loyola University in New Orleans, and is at work on a book about news media, print media in particular, in New Orleans. Also, Jim O'Byrne, who's the Director of State Content for Times Picayune, and James is 2 seats down, sorry. And we have Steve Beatty, who is the editor of The Lens. We're hoping also to be joined by Todd Smith, who is with one of the television stations. What is it,
WWL-TV.
ELT. And hopefully he'll be joining us shortly. So, why don't we begin? First of all, let me just ask for a quick show of hands. How many people here are not from the New Orleans area, not currently living in New Orleans? Okay, good.
I'm sorry about that.
Okay, so we're going to assume that you're like me, and by the way, I'm from California. We're going to assume that you don't know a whole lot about the particulars of the media business in this town. So why don't we begin? Oh, great. I think we're being, Todd is going to be able to join us now. Thank you very much.
Love to make an entrance.
So let's see. Sherry, could you begin just by giving us a quick overview, just sort of a factual description of who the major players are in the media environment of New Orleans now, in no particular order.
All right. First of all, welcome everybody. The basis for my interest in this is the Times Picayune, which is a 175-year-old newspaper, announced about a year ago in May. Actually, the New York Times announced on your behalf, James, that they were going to reduce publication to 3 days a week instead of daily publication. This has caused a great excitement in the local community. The longtime daily newspaper in New Orleans was very, very popular. Meanwhile, in the background, we have WWL-TV that just came in.
Sorry, the long-term daily newspaper is the Times Picayune,
The Times Picayune, and it was part of this community. And the way the change was announced, the fact that the many people in this community are functionally illiterate and are too poor to have access to computers and some other unique aspects of life in the Big Easy have made this situation a little different from in your community if the same thing happened. It's very exciting. I want to give this disclaimer. I'm very prejudiced because I'm a journalist, and as a professor, many of our students went to work for the Times Picayune. So until I signed the book contract, I was not objective, but I'm trying to be very objective today. WWL is, Loyola used to own WWL, so we're very partial to WWL, but being objective, their news ratings, they have traditionally dominated the market here as far as news. The Lend is a new publication which Steve will tell you all about online. It's been on for a couple of years. They're a big player now in this situation. And of course, we have the Gambit Weekly, which we don't seem to have mentioned, but they're a very significant news organization in this community also. And the Advocate, which is published in Baton Rouge. We have the former longtime executive editor that you all know, Linda Lightfoot. She's been out of it for, 6 years now, and there's nobody here to speak about the Advocate, but I'm trying to be objective. The Advocate promptly announced that they would start doing a New Orleans edition the very day that the Times-Picayune went to 3 days a week. So as of October 1st, the Advocate from Baton Rouge has been publishing in New Orleans a daily edition of the Daily Advocate. And that sets the stage for this exciting adventure that's been going on around here for the past year.
Okay, so in the past year then, New Orleans has gone from, as far as print media are concerned, New Orleans has gone from being a city in which the legacy dominant daily newspaper, which had been publishing, I guess, 7 days a week, went to less than 7 days a week, to a situation towards the end of the year, beginning of this year, in which it now has two, not one, but two print daily newspapers. Is that correct? So that's the Times-Picayune and the Advocate, which is planning or has already launched an edition for the New Orleans.
Already launched.
Steve, tell us a little bit about the Lens. First of all, are you a nonprofit or a for-profit entity?
We are, unlike the other newspapers, on purpose, we're a nonprofit. We're part of kind of a new experiment in journalism that started about 7 or 8 years ago with the Voice of San Diego. A lot of newspapers were cutting back on their most expensive and most experienced reporters, investigative reporters, and a lot of newspapers gave people a year's buyout. You know, here's a year's worth of salary, go away. And since the internet creates free printing presses, a lot of these folks decided to start their own publications. We are part of an umbrella group called the Investigative News Network. There's about 80 investigative news websites that are nonprofit across the country. I encourage each of you to find the ones closest to you and make friends with them, because we're very much on the same page.
Are those all co-owned or just loosely affiliated?
No, it's not. These are, we share a lot of funders. Knight, Open Society, Ethics and Excellence, all folks that support this organization. But no, these kind of all sprung up organically on their own, and then we found each other as we tried to understand how to create journalism. We, as a nonprofit, it is our goal right now to be ubiquitous with our information as opposed to syndicated. We have a really bad business plan in that we give away all our copy. But as Dr. Alexander said, a lot of people in New Orleans don't have internet access. We make it a priority to have partners in radio, print, and television. We are partnered with one of Todd's competitors here, the Fox affiliate in town. James's organization, NOLA.com, has picked up our copy on their website. We give our copy to the Advocate's New Orleans edition. We're partners with the NPR station here in town, the local radio station that does Reading for the Blind, reads our publication. So we try to be everywhere as much as we can. As a nonprofit, we kind of want to be like Switzerland a little bit in this newspaper war that's budding in town, but I think it's probably more accurate to say we're like the arms dealer. We're selling to both sides. You know, we would love for NOLA.com to run the copy of us as well as the Advocate, so when people pick up their publication of choice, they're getting the information from the Lens. And that makes our funders happy, which makes them write us more checks, which makes us happy.
Great. Okay, so you have this wonderful wealth of news outlets that have been around for a long time, expanding dramatically, one from one market to another from less than daily publication to daily publication, and all these other publications. Let's talk about the sustainability from a business standpoint of this plethora of news organizations. Jim, could you give us your
Well, I think
impressions of
I
how
look
much
ar-
of this will still be here in a couple of the current situation from a business standpoint, and perhaps how much of it will still be here in a couple of years?
Well, we plan to be here in a couple of years, certainly, but I'm struck by how many people in the room are typing on their iPads and using their phones, and we're having a conversation about why print is struggling. The reality we have to start with in any conversation about journalism in the United States right now is that print journalism has been completely ravaged as an industry. Just a few stats that you all are fairly familiar with. 46,600 journalism jobs lost since 2008, 46,600. Since 2000, newspaper advertising revenue has fallen 65%. Newspaper circulation nationwide has declined every 6-month period for 9 straight years. And papers have shed almost 20 million subscribers since 1990. So what we're trying to do, and it's interesting because there are two narratives. The one narrative is Times-Picayune cuts back to 3 days a week, leaves the city with the largest city in America without a daily newspaper, et cetera. But the narrative when you're here is quite different. What we're trying to do is trying to create a sustainable, profitable business model for journalism. And we're doing that in an environment which is actually one of the more exciting environments in which to be doing journalism in the country, I think. Because you have all of these different experiments and different organizations trying to figure out what the best way to deliver news to a community is. We are determined to come up with a different model in the profit sphere. Steve's organization is working a nonprofit model. We're working in a competitive environment, not just with the Advocate's print product, but with WWL as a substantial breaking news organization in this town. The other TV stations do a good job on breaking news as well, but not, in my estimation, not as strong as WWL does. So if you're a member of this community, far from being underserved right now in the news sphere, I would argue that it's one of the best places to be if you want to be an informed citizenry, an informed populace, because there are a tremendous number of sources of news in a competitive environment trying to make sure that everyone gets the information they need. Despite the newspaper war narrative that everyone embraces, the Advocate and the Times-Picayune just joined together about 3 or 4 weeks ago to successfully sue LSU, which is declining to reveal the names of their 35 finalists for the president of the university system. We won at the district court. I'm sure that LSU will appeal to the appellate court, but it shows that far from denying the populace a robust watchdog press apparatus, in fact, all of these players in the field actually make it a very rich and diverse environment and a very, from the public standpoint, a very well-served community for journalism, in my estimation. But how many of them survive long-term? I think that's the million-dollar question for journalism everywhere, isn't it? How are we as a society going to be informed in 5 or 10 years as this digital revolution continues to completely disrupt and destroy industry after industry, including our very own?
Just a little bit more about the business model for your papers, for your paper. So you have a website. Hopefully, the folks out there can see just the homepage of it. And so you have a substantial digital presence as well as the print product. Is it the business model looking forward to be moving eventually to a primarily, if not an exclusively, digital news presence?
Well, I think the digital clearly is the future of information in all forms. I mean, we used to say, well, there'll always be a printed newspaper because you can't take the newspaper on the subway, and now we have the iPad and the phone. You can certainly take the newspaper on the subway now, no problem. So our business model is based upon a simple proposition that if you continue to home deliver 7 days a week, you can't sustain a profit model for journalism in the long term. Therefore, you can't pay a professional, well-trained newsroom to cover a community. So you have to figure out a way to get at the cost structure in order to reinvest in content. So you take the days you were printing and not making money, and you stop printing and delivering those papers to people's lawns, and you save a tremendous amount of money and you reinvest in content. We still have more than 150 journalists in the New Orleans area covering this community. That still makes us the largest news organization by far in the state of Louisiana, best equipped to respond to news. Now, we're investing a tremendous amount of energy and effort in digital content. We actually have a print operation that takes the content we've already posted on the website to make the papers. And we're also investing heavily in increasing digital revenue. The fundamental question is, can we get to a point 3, 5, 7, 9 years down the road where not enough old people are left to keep subscribing to the paper, that we can pay the cost of professional, profit-driven journalism through the means of digital revenue? That's the big question that every single print, 7-day-a-week daily newspaper in America is grappling with. We're trying to focus a tremendous amount of energy and effort on growing that digital audience, growing that digital revenue going forward, so that when the time comes, when we need to rely upon it, we have enough there to actually make a go of it.
Thank you. Todd, could you comment about the role of your paper's website, its digital, its online presence in the totality of the business that you're with?
Well, I think we're very much in a situation in which there's a transition taking place in our industry. And increasingly, what we're referring to ourselves as is less of a television station and more as a content provider. Content is really and truly the commodity in which we deal. It's what we produce. It's eventually what we give back to the public, the consuming public. If we take that approach long term, I think what we'll find and what we're looking towards is the market will guide us where it wants to be. And industries that ignored the marketplace, for example, the music industry, for many years ignored the impact that digital could have on its business models. If we look at what happened to record companies and the prior distribution systems, and then to the point where they got to where they were actually suing the consumers of their product to stop them from sharing it in a manner that they wanted to, it eventually led to Apple becoming the largest player in the music industry because they understood the opportunity that existed and they took advantage of it. So we have the advantage as a content producer to look at other industries and see what's happened, and then say, okay, the marketplace will guide us in the manner in which it wants to be educated and informed. And it's up to us to determine a business model that would make it sustainable. The CEO of REI always says, and I think this is a very apropos, without margin, there is no mission. Without the ability to finance the things that we want to do, you can't really achieve your mission. And I think that's what James was saying.
Let me also fill you in on some fun things that in this highly competitive journalism outfit market has created. 3 people who worked for The Lens now work for NOLA.com. People who work for NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune, left and now work for Todd. I know that other people on my staff are being recruited by both The Advocate and the Times-Picayune. I hired somebody from The Gambit, the alternative news weekly. So we're all kind of mixing and matching. And I worked at the Times-Picayune for 15 years, and this is kind of the Times-Picayune diaspora, going out to all the other outlets. And as James said, it's a fabulous time to be a news consumer in this town. And what's important for folks at this conference to understand is we're all putting in public records requests. We're all trying to run fast and to beat the other guys. And right now, we're all sprinting. And I think the question you asked earlier is, are we going to be able to maintain this sprint? Part of that will depend on how much the readers find our work appealing and exciting. But I would wager that the city's public information officers are probably getting a lot more public records requests than they ever have before, because we're all looking for that different angle, the thing that's going to set us apart. So it's a fabulous time to be a journalist and a lousy time to be a PIO.
So it's a fabulous time to be a consumer of news and a fabulous time in this particular town, at this particular moment, to be a journalist as well.
I'm very interested in what the effect of all this will have on the ability and the interest to cover government, to get public records and so on. And James cited so far, I think, the one and only time where both newspapers, both daily newspapers, so to speak, requested this information. And I've been following it. I'm going to do a study. This study, isn't through yet. But my understanding is you have the same lawyer. I don't know if she's going to be here later today. Lori Mintz, is she here? She's here later. And maybe she can explain, how it came to be. But I'm very interested in seeing how many of these requests come from the traditional legacy papers when there's no longer beat reporters to the extent that there used to be. There's no longer, people covering on a regular basis the city councils, the school boards, and so on. And quite frankly, are these struggling business decisions going to overwhelm the ability of these people to get the papers to pay for lawyers to file these kind of complaints, which really you all know better than anybody, you need the lawyers to file the complaints to keep the watchdog. And I've only found a few studies that have been done in cities that no longer have a daily newspaper, but they're finding fewer people vote, fewer people run for office, and I'm very interested to see how many people make these public records requests. So I'm going to be watching you, James.
Is it fair to say that if you compared the situation of enforcement lawsuits to enforce public record requests where there have been denials, if you compare the situation today to the situation 10 or 15 years ago, are we seeing much less of that litigation where it's needed in order to extract information from reluctant, recalcitrant agencies, or are we seeing the same level of that activity or more?
I think we've actually maintained that level, and one thing I think is not quite accurate, and Linda can confirm this, but I think the Advocate and the Times-Picayune historically have looked for opportunities to join forces to take particularly state agencies to task for failure to turn over information. It makes good economic sense because you're not, paying two sets of lawyers to file the exact same lawsuit, and we both want the information for the same reasons. And even in a competitive environment, it still behooves us to continue to join forces where appropriate. I don't think that just because you're focusing your content efforts in the digital space and trying to be on all platforms, that automatically means that you're not going to pursue those things that make for great journalism. And we're still going to look for opportunities to ferret out wrongdoing and corruption where we see it. And if they won't turn over the documents to us, we don't hesitate to go to court.
My concern is with the business, obviously the most important thing from your point of view is the business, and click-driven and search engine optimization stories tend to favor sports stories, personalities, and so on, and people aren't rushing to read, the latest corruption of the city councilman or something like that, and that's what I'm very interested in seeing what happens when you're dominated by the online, and are you going to be run by the click-driven parameters rather than the news values of the past?
I'm going to let Todd comment on that as well, but in this town, breaking news is what drives readership. This is a great breaking news town. I can tell you that we got extraordinary audience from the Mother's Day shooting stories because people come to us for breaking news to find out what's going on in their city.
And I'd have to agree. This is New Orleans. I just got back from New York and the CBS upfronts, and so you're there with stations from across the country. And New Orleans plays like a much larger news town than its market size would, particularly when you compare it to a New York or an LA or something like that. We have a lot of things going on here. And as James mentioned, breaking news usually bubbles to the top. Now for us, obviously, we also have weather, which can be breaking news in an environment like this. But the other thing that I'd like to point out is that over time, hopefully what has happened and what will continue to happen is that the efficiencies with which we can gather information creates those opportunities that we don't necessarily stop doing what we're doing because we've become more efficient and effective at doing it. I can remember back when I was a Loyola student, I worked at WWL then, and to go out and cover a story, you had a photographer, you had a guy carrying a cassette deck to record it and carry the mic, and you had the reporter. You don't have that now. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't cover those types of stories or that you don't have the personnel to do it. It just means that the technology, perhaps, and hopefully, what it should do, has allowed us to do more and do it more efficiently.
Well, regarding whether there's more litigation or we're actively going after it, I think there's a greater increase in nasty letters from lawyers. You know, my counsel, Scott Sternberg, here in the front row at the far end, helps me write some nasty letters. We haven't gotten to the point of litigation yet, which when I was at the Times-Picayune, it drove me nuts because you got to the point where you wanted to go to the managing editor and say, can't we just sue the bastards? They're not coming through. But the goal for the Picayune on most cases was to get the information you were going after in that instance, not to set a principled legal standard that you could rely on later. Well, then along come the upstarts like The Lens, and there's a very healthy investigative blogging community in New Orleans that have garnered lawsuits against them. So you know they must be doing something right. But we all run the risk of making really bad law. So there are only a few First Amendment stud attorneys in town. And the nice thing is for us to go to them and say, you know, we're going to stumble into court and make really bad law unless you're willing to help us on a pro bono basis. And that has a very motivating factor because, you know, we're going to make bad law that their clients have to live with. So that has helped us to some degree.
That's very interesting. I wanted to get to that because I think it's an important message for everybody in this room that it isn't necessarily just for news organizations to initiate litigation in those situations where you reach an impasse and litigation is the only way to go. Nonprofit organizations can play a crucial role in organizing a litigation effort and hopefully being able to get pro bono, that is to say, free legal representation from large law firms or small, or lawyers who do this all the time on a pro bono basis. But there is pro bono legal representation usually available if you cultivate it. And one of the ways to make that happen and to be most effective in litigation is to play that role in collaboration with the major media outlets in your community. The very media who will make use of documents that you're trying to get if they are ultimately released. That increases the credibility of the litigation effort, and it also increases the chances that the information that you obtain, should you prevail in the litigation, will result in news stories that can actually affect public policy in a positive way.
And to Steve's point, the Daily Reveille, the daily LSU paper, also sought the names of the finalists, and we invited them to join us in the suit, and they decided they wanted to make a splash and do their own suit. So they sued for the exact same thing, independent of us, knowing our suit was going forward. We won our suit and suggested they might want to withdraw their suit. They persisted and lost. So now you have two district court rulings in the state of Louisiana from two different judges, one of which says LSU has to give the names and one of which says they don't have to give the names, which guarantees an appeal.
That's really hard to understand because they gain nothing, there was nothing to gain by continuing the litigation after your initial victory, because the records that you would have gotten.
Yeah, Scott was also the attorney.
Lawyer on
Yeah.
that suit, we did try to withdraw, and the judge didn't let us, so.
The judge
I'm
would
sorry.
not let you withdraw the case.
I apologize.
Oh,
I
that's very interesting.
wish I knew that information. I appreciate it.
Okay. Someone mentioned a moment ago coverage of city councils and school boards and the like. And we've been talking about the media ferment here and the intensity of coverage of breaking news in the major headline kinds of stories, and also some about investigative reporting. What about the kind of day in and day out nuts and bolts reporting at a kind of micro-local level of baseball scores and city council meetings and school board meetings? Do you guys agree that that's not being done nearly to the extent it used to be?
Well, particularly with schools, New Orleans is a weird place right now because after Katrina, the charter movement came in and exploded. There are 45 charter school boards in this city that run about 80 charter schools. And each one of those 45 boards meets once a month. And they all have public, they're subject to open records, public meetings law. And you know, there's not an outlet out there that's available to put 45 meetings in print. The Lens got a grant from the Knight Foundation to start a charter school reporting corps. I pay a group of freelancers $50 a meeting to cover each one of those meetings. And that's part of what NOLA.com has picked up and what The Advocate has run. So this, I think, is an example of how at least the nonprofit group can come in and fill this gap and serve the for-profit, which ultimately serves the community. Prior to that, nobody covered a lot of these boards. We showed up at some of these board meetings and they're sitting around kind of a conference table and they asked who we are and we said, you know, we're the media and we'd like to join. And they're like, well, come on up. We got a seat at the table. And we're like, that's a little weird. We're just going to sit over here and watch. And then they started asking us questions like, can we go into executive session? And I'm like, no, that's an easy one. You know, let me help you with that. And I think to that degree, we're covering a little more of the meat and potatoes. At the same time, we first started a few years ago tweeting from city council meetings, and the Lens was the only one doing that regularly. Now, if you turn the Twitter tubes on to the New Orleans City Council, you'll find NOLA.com, The Advocate, the Business Weekly, the television stations, and the Alternative Weekly. So you can get 5 or 6 different Twitter feeds from the council meeting, which I think, again, if you're a news consumer willing to go out and find this, it's a fabulous time.
So that means there are 5 or 6 reporters working for different news organizations at a city council meeting in New Orleans?
At least.
Is that surprising to most people in this room? It's very surprising to me coming from California.
But what about the Metairie City Council?
We're there as well.
5 or 6 of you?
Right now, the Lens only has the bandwidth for the city of New Orleans, but should you be willing to make a generous donation, we might consider expanding. You might note from yesterday's panel, you know, don't hesitate to ask for a donation. That should be on our page up there.
But one thing that is interesting, though, is that, you know, obviously many, many years ago, before cable became as prevalent as it is, now you can watch the city council meeting all day long if you'd like to. So, I mean, I think there are opportunities are out there. I recently moved back to New Orleans from Hampton Roads, in Virginia, the Norfolk area. And we had an interesting situation there because our DMA was made up of 7 different cities. And within those 7 different cities, you had 7 different city councils, you had 7 different school districts, which is now basically what New Orleans is facing. And it does become, okay, what do we do? Actually, we had 2 daily newspapers, but one served, which would be the equivalent of our North Shore, and one served the South Shore. And they never crossed each other's jurisdiction, so to speak. So it's really interesting to see that the information is out there. You know, as Steve mentioned, a consumer who really wants that information, it is there. And I would put forth that, and we've talked about this before, that with all of the different distribution systems and all, there's probably been an increase in local information consumption. It's just that there's no metric measuring it across all those different platforms yet.
And also, let's keep in mind quality, not just quantity. In other words, anybody can sit and watch the meeting, but do we have the institutional memory? Do we have a journalist who remembers 22 years ago when this councilman did so-and-so, and then something comes up? In case nobody's aware of it, which I'm sure there isn't anybody in this room who's not aware of it, Louisiana is a delightful state in so many ways, and one trademark, I just wrote a whole book about famous New Orleans trials, courtroom carnival. We have many, many, many politicians who have been corrupt, and really it's the press that follows these people and brings down these people. We're still bringing down our former mayor that all of you know from Hurricane Katrina days, Mayor Ray Nagin. He was keeping his records confidential. He said it was a racist to require transparency. Finally, the press stayed with it. They got his records, and now he's been indicted. I mean, we're still following that story. That would never have happened unless the press kept at him. And that's what I'm concerned with, is the hit and run going to take over the beat reporter, the solid person investigating, sticking with the story, you know, running these politicians till finally they can't run anymore.
Well, I mean, you're talking about a potential future, and I don't think that that's our mission and our goal. I don't think there's any evidence that there's a lack of, as Steve mentioned, accountability and good reporting going on in this city right now. What happens 5 years from now, I don't know. I mean, if I could predict the future 5 years from now, I'd be rich. But, you know, we're trying to maintain what we've always done, which is be a watchdog, do aggressive investigative and enterprise journalism, do good daily journalism, and cover the city. The real threat to the newspaper, the general newspaper business model, and the threat to what Sherry's talking about is not other newspapers. It is the Uptown Messenger microblog, which is affiliated with WWL. It's one guy driving around Uptown, New Orleans, doing a tremendously effective job covering his micro neighborhood. It is all these little, it's the Lens, taking investigative as a vertical. It's all of these smaller organizations trying to take verticals away. And the fundamental question is, can you still maintain a profit-based, mission-driven, general interest journalism organization? We have an idea to try to do it, because delivering 7 days a week on people's lawns is definitely not it. Anybody who thinks it is, I'd love to hear the economics of how that works. Right. So we have an idea, and we're testing it out, and we believe that it's possible to continue to do that. Whether it is or not, we'll find out. The market will determine.
I also think that if you are not in the business of doing investigative or original reporting and providing original content, that is a certain way for you to not exist long term. Because if anything is available across a number of different platforms and you don't own it, then you're not going to differentiate your brand from anyone else's. So I think all of us know intuitively that we have to find a way to continue that enterprise journalism, that investigative journalism that sets our brands apart, because if we don't, we become a commodity. And I think that's the biggest fear for anybody in mass media, is that you become a commodity and you're an interchangeable part of a system that exists and I can get it from anywhere. And your brand being attached to it has no meaning or value to the consumer anymore. I think that's the biggest fear, because that's a certain way for you not to be able to exist long term and make a financial go of it, so to speak.
If I can go off on a bit of a tangent, but something that I've heard from a couple different panels. The business discussion, it passed me over in journalism school. It was not anything that I was ever educated for. And the difference between the state press associations and your organizations as freedom of information outlets, I think, continues to diverge. And that's something we should be very aware of, that press associations are becoming lobbying agencies for the business side, you know, keeping the public notices and making that money. And it's not always in line with what we want for open information, and we've got to be very aware of that. I mean, frequently we want our organizations to work, ours, because I'm part of the New Orleans Coalition on Open Governance. We want to work with the Press Association, but we have to be very aware that our interests are not aligned. And I think it's interesting that's come up in panel after panel, and I would caution each of you to be very aware of that as you go about, you know, creating good law and bad and monitoring. You're going to have to watch the watchdogs a little bit.
Interesting. I'd like to probe a little bit further about sustainability. And granted, of course, we can't see 5 years ahead, but maybe we can at least try to see ahead a year or two. So, Steve, you mentioned that your business model basically is nonprofit by design. I'm assuming, though, that you don't have any principled objection to generating revenue from your editorial if you were able to. For example, if people were willing to pay on a syndication basis or on a consumer basis on your website for your content, you'd be happy to take their money, correct?
Right. We are always open to taking money. Some of our peer organizations have syndicated agreements, groups in Denver and New England. We're kind of operating on the crack dealer basis right now for this year, trying to get everybody hooked on our content and become indispensable to them. I hope I'm not giving too much away, but in 2014 we may be discussing with our partners, you know, some kind of a little something coming our way. But for right now, like I said earlier, our goal is to become ubiquitous and make people very aware of who we are as a relatively young organization at 3 years old. I feel like we're punching above our weight by getting our information out broadly, and that's part of our business plan. As people become more used to our copy, I would hope that they would find value in it and be willing to pay for it next year.
So currently you have syndication arrangements in which you provide content free to other outlets, and there's a possibility you'll try to negotiate getting some kind of compensation in the future. What about putting a paywall on your website and trying to get readers to pay for what they read?
We're not, again, we want to get our information out to as many people as possible without putting any barriers up between us and the reader, and we feel like a paywall would be that. We've thought about premium content on our site, where if you're a subscriber or a member, you might be available for a live chat with a reporter or other things. But again, we're very conscious of not creating kind of a information caste system,
Right.
where those who can afford it get it. It's nice to be nonprofit and kind of stand on principle and say we want to get our information out to everybody. Whether that runs up against the buzzsaw of reality of the finances is yet to be seen.
But so far, right, in terms of your business strategy right now, it sounds to me like you're committed, you're locked into a model in which you either get foundations to give you money, in which case you continue in business, or foundations stop giving you money and you go out of business. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a
that's a
charitable
pretty
arrangement.
that's a pretty harsh,
I'm
but
just-
accurate diagnosis.
Yeah, exactly.
Increasingly, we've
I'm familiar with it because it's the same one that same illness I have.
I mean, we're partnered with the local NPR station, not only for distribution, but their expertise. I mean, public radio, people have come to understand they need to pay for their public radio. And we're increasingly, we're growing our local donor database, whether they're $10 donors or $50 or $1,000 donors. We're getting more of them than we had before.
Okay. And Jim, so the Times-Picayune obviously is not a charitable organization, a nonprofit organization. And I think everybody here will have to agree with you that there's not a huge margin for any newspaper today in delivering stacks of printed media on the front lawns of as many Americans as will buy it. And so some kind of digital play is going to be crucial to maintaining margins or creating margins, presumably, for your company. And I noticed that Your website also is without a paywall. Are you going to be looking, or can you, one, are you going to be looking for consumers of your news to pay something for it? And if not, how are you going to get to sustainable profitability without doing that?
We don't have a paywall, and the truth is that I don't think there's a Metro Daily yet in the United States that has shown a paywall to be, in and of itself, profitable or worthwhile. The fundamental challenge of a paywall is, as Steve says, it reduces your audience. And that fundamentally is in conflict with trying to grow your audience and grow your digital revenue. It's a really good strategy if you say to me, if you come to me and say, our primary goal is to protect our Sunday circulation, because that's really what paywalls do. Usually the cost of a Sunday paper is the same as or less than access to the website. And so the paywall is fundamentally designed to protect print. So you have to decide what you want to do. As a short-term strategy to protect your print circulation, it's very effective. As a long-term strategy for survival, it doesn't have a long-term effectiveness that anyone can see yet. The New York Times paywall, whether it's successful or not, is still debatable in academic circles, but it doesn't have a lot to teach us about the local market because it's a national newspaper, an international newspaper. So fundamentally, if someone shows us a paywall that in and of itself works, we're all in. But so far we haven't seen that, and it suppresses your audience so much that it's interesting to me that whenever there's a big giant news story, everybody takes down their paywalls as a public service. Well, if we're in the public service business, we want to maintain our mission orientation in journalism, then it's interesting that when we have to actually serve the audience, we won't go ahead and take down the paywall to serve the audience, and we put it back up later. People never paid for content. They paid for the cost of delivering the ink and the paper and the fuel to get that physical product onto your lawn. The content was always paid for by advertisers. So the fundamental question we're trying to answer is, even with the lower margins in the digital space, can you be creative enough and aggressive enough to eventually get to the point where you're making enough in the digital space?
And your view is that nobody has figured out how to do that at the local level?
If someone shows me,
possibly it could be done at a national.
if someone shows me
level.
hey, the paywall works and everyone wants to pay for content on the internet model, I mean, it shows the company that, then we're all, I think everybody is, no one has a philosophical objection to getting people to pay for content.
So there are two places where I think we can all agree that a paywall of some kind does work. One is highly vertical publications with either geographically defined or demographically defined audience, all having a very common interest, like financial newsletters or legal information for lawyers, where there's also a willingness and a business need to pay. And apparently, or let's say hopefully, sorry?
Sports, ESPN.
And sports too. ESPN and cable in many ways, exactly. And then at the other end of the scale, there's the New York Times, which I certainly hope, and it's beginning to look as though they may be able to make it work. And you're exactly right. The reason the paywall does work there is that the incremental cost of picking up new subscribers in London and New York, et cetera, is zero. And they're not just maxed out. And their editorial content obviously has great relevance to an audience beyond their geographic boundaries. But it seems to me that something has to be, some kind of business model has to be developed for everything in between, or we're at risk of well, not being able to continue to have the wonderfully rich and varied news coverage which this town is accustomed to, and which it's now having again, but under some rather peculiar circumstances, which unfortunately may not last.
Let me ask a curious question. How many people know a way around the New York Times paywall? Okay, yeah.
I do, but I subscribe anyway. Is it time to go to Q&A? We will do that. Thank you, Robert. Oh, please, let's move on to Q&A. Are you-
I'll pass the microphone around. And, you know, I think it's, as a former editor and reporter with the Times-Picayune, looking back now, I think it's a richer, more competitive news environment in New Orleans than I've ever seen since I've been there. And when you watch the evolution of WWL on radio and television and the website, hiring some great talent, watching the lens grow up. And the Picayune, now NOLA, I think the reason we put this panel together was because we see this coming to your community soon. And James and I have talked about this for years before it happened. I think what's been happening is it was inevitable that somehow or another it was going to take place. And I think one of the lessons to keep in mind on this is that the Picayune NOLA did this at a time when it had resources to try to put into the new product. And I think James would agree with me on this. Now, some newspapers may wither away to the point when they want to make that bold transition, and they may not have as many resources to do it. And so doing it early, maybe even before the community was ready to let go, that seven-day-a-week paper may turn out in the end to look like the right thing to do. I know everybody's beating up James on what they did, but I think people will look back at it as a courageous thing he had to do and they were going to do. We can complain later about how they did it and the mistakes they made. But I just think what we want to try to focus on here in your questions too is not so much resolving what the future of media is, so much as looking at the impact of these types of things on transparency and on freedom of information. And so that's where I hope we can get some of our questions aimed at as we come up here. And my question really is for Sherry. And is there some way of measuring, studying, analyzing, and figuring out what the impact is on transparency and open government as these media changes are going on? How would you do it?
Very preliminary studies have been done. People have taken one little aspect. For instance, they've noted there's so few communities so far, so we're going to be one of the first, and people could be studying us. My concern is going to be to study the effect of the change on coverage of government, on lawsuits, on access to information by the general public. People have started to study, as I said, there's fewer voters. People stop voting. People stop running. Fewer people run for office. They've done a couple of preliminary studies. Fewer people run for office in the communities that no longer have a daily. So this is the kind of, long-range studies that really have to be done. Mine is just a little sample because of the colorful way it's been done here. But I guess university professors are going to be studying this for the next lifetime till they get tenure anyway.
A question over here.
Hi. It's heartening, I think, I'm sorry, I'm Sarah Nordgren from Associated Press, and it's heartening, I think, to hear about the really fertile ground in New Orleans right now for covering news, and that all of you outlets are there. The concern that I have as a journalist, and also just in terms of open government, is that the efforts are spread out among many outlets, and that you, by nature, must be driven by spot news and the daily occurrences that are going on. I come from a school that would argue that there is a certain amount of expertise that professional journalists bring to the table, and paying people $50 a pop to go to a school council meeting is a great thing, But do they then have the opportunity to collaborate in a newsroom and learn from each other and begin to do the hard thinking and kind of work that has, been the hallmark of so many really important open government efforts? How your staffing has been affected just in terms of the State House, the City Council, and that sort of thing? And does that concern you, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
There's no advocate person there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Who wants to be the advocate person of the day? Who wants to speak for the advocate?
As the representative of Legacy Print, I'll speak. The model as it is currently configured is designed to redirect assets to content. So we still cover every meeting. We still go to those important sort of institutional gatherings where stuff is happening. We're all concerned. I mean, I read the statistics. We're all concerned, but I think journalism, newspaper journalism particularly, has been really good at being concerned and not so good at trying new things. The level of innovation needed to survive in this environment, which is changing so incredibly dramatically, is extreme, and the level of innovation that our industry as a whole has brought to it is tentative, in my estimation. So we're trying to do it. We have fewer editors, and one of the things that you have in the new model is fewer editors, because a lot of the editing apparatus that exists in a newsroom exists to handle the funnel of content that comes in at 6 o'clock that you have to turn around and get on a press at midnight. It's so you overstaff for those moments where you have this crush of flow, because the workflow that I did when I was a reporter is completely different from the workflow that reporters do now. When I talk to young reporters now about what they have to do, I freely concede to them, you guys work 3 times harder than I worked as a journalist. There's no question about that. And we did great journalism when I was a young journalist, but the rhythm of my day was such that, you come in, you have coffee, you make a few phone calls, you go to lunch, you come back, you have a few conversations about the Saints, you make a few more phone calls, and at 3 o'clock you go, holy shit, I got to do my story, and then for the next 3 hours you'd go like a bat out of hell, and you turn your story into the editor and you go home. Now you got to get up, check your Twitter feed, send out a tweet, make sure you didn't get your ass beat on breaking news overnight, and that's from the time you get up to the time you go to bed and beyond. We all sleep with our cell phones now because they go off in the middle of the night with my WWL news alert that I've just been beaten on a story. The world is completely different. But the tools and the energy that I see young journalists bring to this equation is really quite heartening to me. I don't see, my son wants to be a journalist, and I spent years trying to talk him out of it. And the people who come into the business now, because the business model is dead, have such an incredible sense of mission and dedication to task that I don't fear for the future of journalism right now. I don't. I know I'm supposed to. I look at the numbers and say, well, we're dead. But I also look at these young, talented, technologically savvy folks. I mean, the finest photographs from the Mother's Day shooting were from a reporter who was there just because she wanted to be in a second line. She's been in New Orleans. She actually works out of Baton Rouge, in our Baton Rouge hub. She wanted to experience a second line. She's been in New Orleans for 7 months. She has an iPhone 5 that we equipped her with when we started a new company. We equipped everyone with MacBook Pros and iPhone 5s, which, by the way, is not what you do when you're trying to suck all the money out of the business and go into decline. And she took some iPhone 5 photographs from that scene because they were immediate, that are the best photographs. You've all seen them multiple times because they're on all the networks, and all the AP picked up the photographs, and so all the publications around the country have her photographs from that scene. So I see these talented reporters coming out of school who know that they're going into what is purely mission work. They're now more like teachers than we were, because we kind of felt like we had a good shot at a career when we came out of J school. I don't know what my son's going to do when he gets out of school other than turn his student loans over to me. But they're incredibly dedicated and passionate about doing journalism. So yes, they're willing to work for less money than we worked for, because they are so mission driven. So I don't fear right now for the future of journalism. Maybe I should.
And yeah, we pay $50 a meeting for these. We set the bar very low when we started covering this because there was no coverage of these charter schools before. So we managed to achieve that low bar. I mean, it's almost like stenography journalism. But there have been some reporters who have pitched freelance ideas that have come out of that we've paid hundreds of dollars for bigger stories. And we're doing our part to try to bring along the next level of misguided journalists who think there's a future in this. And while we are partnered with...
If they get really good, we'll hire them away. Thanks.
That's fine. That's a point of pride for us. But we outgrew our space in the television station that we started with, and we're now at Loyola University, and we're dedicated to working with the journalism students and trying to bring them along and working with them. So I agree there's a level of expertise that's needed, and we're starting to pay a premium for the same freelancers who cover the same board meetings because they've established a relationship with those folks.
Linda Peterson, Utah Foundation for Open Government, also a working journalist. The question I have is for James. James, and maybe also Todd, you said pretty much everything is on the table in terms of survival. In my market, we're seeing where the dailies, the budgets that they had for litigation, the budgets that they had for FOI work are in the toilet. There is nothing compared to what there used to be. And in our market, we have always relied heavily on the dailies to lead the charge, and those of us with no money could ride on their shirt tails. Basically, in fact, what the dailies are doing, they're trying to form, and they actually have formed the Utah Media Coalition, but they're actually trying to form a foundation to get grantors to give them money. In fact, they're trying to follow the NFOIC model. Hilariously, they wouldn't listen to me and had attorneys go online, charging them hundreds of dollars to come back and say, hey, we found this great model. And I said, yeah, this is the NFOIC, the one I told you about. Anyway, back to my point. Back to my point. Are you finding that where you really, like you said, you have to look at everything, are you finding that that budget has been slashed from in the past?
Not currently in our organization, because first off, I don't think what's happening here, I think the company that went first in reducing frequency of home delivery had to be a private company. It's interesting that this so-called newspaper war is happening among two privately held firms. So we're actually in the mode of reinvesting in our company. We're trying to grow our company and reverse the downward trend and reverse the model of decline. That's not necessarily the situation in the rest of the country, where you have publicly held papers who have a bottom line to hit. And one of the problems that our industry is in is the reason we went to 3 days home delivery is that you can't, the only way you can stay above the line is to manage costs. So you keep managing costs out of the equation, and costs end up being your content producers, your reporters, your journalists, your newsprint, your ink, the news hole gets smaller and smaller. You're delivering less and less news every day because you have the news hole that can accommodate less and less news, and you have fewer people to do it. The whole model is predicated on getting out of that death spiral. So we don't have right now slashed budgets for doing good journalism. When we want to pursue something that we feel like we should pursue, we go pursue it. And that's the mode we're in right now, and that's why it's really exciting to be here and really exciting to be working in my company.
And I'd have to agree. In my experience as a GM across several different markets within my parent company, I've never had the occasion where somebody said, that line item, you need to reduce it. Coverage, if you, in speaking particularly about litigation, for coverage, if you begin to do that, the thing that you're trying to protect will be damaged irreparably. If you get to the point where you're looking at that line item and you're saying, we can't afford to litigate to get this information, then guess what? Long term, you won't have to worry about it because you won't be around much longer. I'd probably say, since we've hired the 3 guys that we've had from the Picayune, that line item has probably gone up tremendously for us. I talk to a lot of our attorneys a lot more frequently now than I did in the past, but I do think that there are ways that businesses, and I've seen operators do it, where you begin to look at that level of detail and you get to the point where you're actually damaging your product and your brand. And if you do that, you'll find yourself, as James said, in this downward spiral that you can't get out of. So, for example, we just recently sent Brendan went to the Philippines to follow a story that we were doing, an investigative story. And I have to tell you that, you know, that wasn't an easy decision to make. But just like a household budget, you say, okay, this is important enough for us to do, then we've got to find a way to finance it. But we're going to do it because it's a part of our core mission.
Bob Becker from DC Coalition. Steve, particularly you, these people you have who are going out and doing these sort of stenographic kinds of records for you from all these meetings, is there anybody back in your office who's looking at those on a regular basis for patterns that might generate enterprise journalism?
Yeah, we've got an editor who worked for the St. Pete Times, who is an education writer. She now coordinates these, it's probably 15 to 20 freelancers. So she's looking for, yes, the same thing has happened at these 4 schools, and we have a dedicated education writer on the lens, and we'll either turn the story over to her or have her mentor these other reporters and work cooperatively with them. And that's happened more than we expected, that the same problems are cropping up at these schools. So we're doing our best to bring everybody along.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes, so we'll keep the questions short. And then Peter, after we get through this next question, Peter, I'm going to give the mic back to you to kind of close out, okay?
Okay, I'm Pat Dooley from the Kansas Coalition. I'm teaching a class this semester called The Digital Divide, and I'm wondering, and I just was looking up the Louisiana, New Orleans broadband rates, and we have New Orleans has one of the lowest broadband adoption rates in the country for a big city. And for example, about 50% have broadband. And in some neighborhoods like the 9th Ward, much less than that. I'm wondering if in any of your discussions has the issue of the digital divide come up? Because certainly going back to print really makes a huge positive approach, I think.
We actually, the new houses put up $500,000 in New Orleans to try to address digital divide issues. And the money's primarily to give grants to people who are coming up with innovative ideas to give digital access to disadvantaged communities to information and news. But let me just say a word about the data on New Orleans. If you look at the data on New Orleans for smart internet-connected phone penetration, those numbers are significantly higher, and there's a reason for it. They're actually above the national average. And the reason for that is Katrina. Katrina wiped out so much infrastructure that most people switched to digital from landline. I pass this intersection every day where a homeless guy stands out with a sign, and I passed that intersection the other day, and he was taking a break from collecting money, talking on his smartphone. And then that's when I realized that the digital penetration is truly extensive. The digital divide is a national problem. It is an ongoing problem. But if you focus only on broadband access now, 50% of our web traffic during Hurricane Isaac was mobile. And you start looking at mobile phone penetration in a market, that's where people are getting their information. It's here. This is the world now. So I think the broadband stats are a little bit outdated. In fact, I know they're outdated. And if you look at New Orleans, it's not as disadvantaged in terms of access to digital information as those numbers would indicate.
Except for this one caveat that New Orleans is uniquely illiterate. We had before, nothing to do with Katrina, our literacy rates are so low. When Loyola got a new library, the Lindy Boggs Center donated, I think it was $10 million, and we've been trying for 20 years now to raise the literacy rate in New Orleans. So it's a combination of poverty and inability to read, really, isn't conducive to people learning to communicate on a computer, whereas the newspaper gets passed around and it is a little friendlier thing. So that's part of the reason. That's part of the reason that that it had such a big impact in New Orleans, which is.
They can't read. They're not reading the newspaper.
They when they say functionally illiterate, they mean they can read if they have to, or somebody passes them the newspaper. In the barber shops, there's whole stories about how many people would read a newspaper in a barber shop, that type of thing. Just so you know, it's a little, New Orleans is different from every place else. Let's just put it that way.
Indeed it is. Do we have another comment? Go ahead.
No, I just want to say that's one reason why, as a digital outlet, we are committed to having radio, print, or radio and television, so people can just tune us in and listen as well as that. I do think it's a little bit of a convenient dodge to say, oh, those are old numbers and there are new numbers out there. In fact, yes, the digital divide is a nationwide problem, but it is acute in New Orleans. I don't think that there are a lot of people out there accessing a lot of news at all levels of society through their smartphones. I don't know if the homeless guy was checking on the Mother's Day shooting or was doing something else. But I think it's something we have to be very aware of and make sure that we're getting our news out into every media possible.
Well, we're at the end of this session, and I want to thank the panelists. I think this was very, very interesting. And to me, the takeaway is it's somewhat encouraging. I mean, we all know about the enormous problems and challenges confronting the news industry, but I think what you're seeing, what you're hearing here, and what maybe is beginning to dawn on those in the news business all over the country is that whatever business models ultimately gain some kind of traction in the new digital age, and we certainly all hope that someone will find one that does, it's becoming increasingly clear that if you're going to sell journalism, you got to create journalism. And if you don't invest in reporters, and if you don't invest in editors, regardless of the model that you choose, ultimately, that is to say subscriptions or advertising or something else altogether, ultimately you're not going to be able to succeed, and that's because ultimately you're not going to be playing the role that you should be playing in your community of providing real information that people need. Well, so we're at the end. I don't want to hold folks any longer, but I do want to tell you that the next session, which begins at 12, is going to be not here, but in the room next door. So thank you again.